righty. Good afternoon, good afternoon. Please take your seats, please get seated so we can get started and try to get back on schedule. Because it's not just this event that we have, we also have that candidate forum for the governor's race this evening, which I'll say more about. So thank you all. We're now going to get started with our panels on immigration and democracy. And just FYI, to understand sort of run of show stuff, each panel will be 45 minutes of discussion and 15 minutes of Q&A with you all, audience members, and then there are index cards on each of your tables, right? So please write any questions that you have, and the ushers that we have will walk around and collect those cards during the panel discussion, and they can be a part of the Q&A. So in the interest of time, I will not be reading the biographies of each panelist, but I encourage you to view them on the event website. The participants are some of the most effective and inspiring champions that we have here in the Garden State. I will say personally, some of you know me from my previous role. I was director of the New Jersey Policy Perspective. I've had the distinct honor of working with these people very intimately on a variety of policies, a variety of campaigns. They do so much with so little. They accomplish a great deal for our state, and they are always burning the candle at both ends. And so we need to really think about how do we engage in a deeper way, I think heed the words of Ms. Ifill, and how do we plant some seeds. And so please, let's get started. And in earnest with regards to the immigration panel, we're going to start with that first. And so our participants are, please come up as I just say your names, just come up. Our participants are Nedia Morsy, who is the director of Make the Road New Jersey. Amy Torres, who is executive director of the New Jersey Alliance for Immigrant Justice. Amber Reed, who is the co-executive director of AAPI New Jersey. And our wonderful moderator for this conversation is Kachalia, campaign strategist at the ACLU of New Jersey. Thank you. Give them a warm welcome.
Good. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this panel on immigrant justice, and importantly, how all of us in this room, community members, advocates, lawmakers, can meet this moment head on to strengthen and defend our democracy, and importantly, to make sure, as Sherrilyn Ifill said, that we are moving towards transformative change. So by way of background for all of us, New Jersey is one of the most immigrant-rich states in our country. We have the second highest share of immigrants of any state in our country, second only to California. 1 in 4 people here are immigrants themselves. 1 in 6 are a US-born resident with at least one immigrant parent. And so when we talk about immigrant justice, we are not talking about a niche issue. We are talking about our friends, our families, our neighbors. And it's so important in this moment, therefore, that our response is significant, that it's meaningful, and that we are responding not like slowly, but we're meeting the urgency of those attacks with urgency of our own. So as we've already seen, I'm sure many of you are familiar, there has been impact here in the Garden State. There are countless accounts of family separation, of detention and deportation. All of us up here on the stage, I'm sure many of you have gotten those calls about needing rapid response, about worrying what's happening in a school or at a church or down the street. And we know that these attacks are continuing and that they're felt intimately by many of us. Newark actually is the site of not only one of the first raids that happened after inauguration, but it is also the site of one of the first immigration detention contracts that has been signed under the second Trump administration at a facility that's only 10 minutes away at Delaney Hall. And so I think it's really important that we're having this conversation today as we think about what it means to respond in ways that protect our families and protect our communities. At the ACLU, we've been preparing for this moment like many of you. Last year, ACLU released the Firewall for Freedom, which is 75 state and municipal policies that can be passed and implemented in order to better insulate our communities from federal attack. Since inauguration, my colleagues around the country have filed over 24 lawsuits in order to protect everyone, including on day one, lawsuit against the Birthright Citizenship EO. And here in New Jersey, we've been working with our amazing partners, many of whom you'll hear from today, to meet this moment, everything from Know Your Rights to rapid response and legal and policy work. So I'm really thrilled to be joined by my colleagues here. We have a lot to cover today in terms of what is happening right now and, importantly, what we do next. And I'd like to really quickly introduce my colleagues. Nedia Morsy, she's the Executive Director of Make the Road New Jersey. Amy Torres from the New Jersey Alliance for Immigrant Justice, of which the ACLU is a very proud member. And AAPI New Jersey's Amber Reed. So as Brandon mentioned, rather than do long bios, we're going to encourage you all to go on the website and read about their amazing work and get right into the questions. So, over the last 3 months, we have seen a number of changes in both policy and practice at the federal level that have impacted immigrant communities and that will continue to cause harm going forward. What is top of mind for you in this moment as you consider the attacks on immigrant communities and on democracy at large?
Thanks for that question, Ami. Thank you, NJPAC and the Institute and the Fund for New Jersey for having us all here today. Immigrants face Trump every day, even when he's not president, because the white nationalist agenda that he represents is as old as our nation, if not older. I represent an organization that works for the rights and welfare of Asian Americans, and we've seen moments in our history when our labor, our contributions go from sort of being tolerated out of economic necessity to these moments of crisis when you have, us presented as yellow peril or dusky horrors, this sort of menacing other that's used to sort of unite white people against us. Even just recently you had Trump talking about Chinese men of military age coming over the southern border, in this very sinister framing of this sort of new migration pattern. And so you have people who look at people like us, and instead of seeing someone raising her family here who's earnestly making her Google Docs and thinking about whether she's going to eat an ice cream bar tonight, instead of seeing me as an individual, they see me as a member of a very suspect and dangerous class of people. And I think we're seeing, another one of those really dangerous moments when you have the whole apparatus of our laws, our federal government being sort of weaponized in the service of this agenda. We've seen, as you were saying, Ami, a blitz of street arrests, workplace raids, heavily militarized for the purpose of spreading fear. This sort of fake focus on criminals within this incredibly huge, diverse group of 15, 20 million people. The removal of limits on ICE targeting and tactics. You see them coming into spaces that used to be protected, like schools and houses of worship, attacks on birthright citizenship, and just a lot of energy going into stoking this climate of fear so that people self-deport. And when you see Asian immigrants subject to these bridge deportations to jungles in Costa Rica, when you see Bhutanese American refugees who have been here for years and years being deported back to the country they fled from in violation of every established international humanitarian principle, that the fear that instills is exactly the point of this. And we're here today because every American needs to be concerned about this because, as Sherrilyn was saying, the measure of the health of our democracy is how we treat our most vulnerable communities. And they're using sort of these attacks on immigrants as a laboratory or a proving ground for autocracy, essentially. An immigration attorney that I know said, well, they want to deport all these people, but how are they going to get all these hearings through because the courts are already backed up for years? Well, you see them, they're just trying to cut the knot by saying, what if we just got rid of due process, let's just not have hearings and just summarily deport people. You see them invoking the Alien Enemies Act, which was passed in 1798 at a time when America feared war with France, a time when we had no federal law enforcement agencies, intelligence agencies. There's never been a time in our history when treating someone as not as an individual, but sort of condemning them out of hand because they're members of a certain class or of a certain race or country of origin. Like, there are no positive examples of that, right? Like, that's always bad when it happens. And yet our own government is invoking that now, and that should be a deep concern to anyone who cares about this democracy.
Thank you, Ami. And I think to Amber's point, there is a broader story happening here. I think it's important to remember that fascism feeds on despair. It feeds on starvation. It is able to divide us when people are struggling to think about where their next paycheck is going to come from and how they're going to pay their rent. And I feel deeply, right, that this moment that we're in is really driven by a lack of taxing the rich. If we were able to tax the rich, and if we were able to make sure that the wealthy paid their fair share and corporations paid their fair share, you wouldn't have a situation where people are grasping at straws, fighting for scarce resources, and then in that way needing to justify why it is that we must separate each other. And that is the moment that we're currently in, right? Where people have, there's the ultra-right has taken the word immigration and has attempted to make it radioactive. And we need to reclaim that word. We need to reclaim our community. But their success has been the fascism that feeds off of scarcity. And so I think, we have created a collective resistance in the state that has made it so that Trump 1.0 wasn't able to carry out their promises in totality. And we will do that in Trump 2.0. And I think to the point about due process, I want to share a story with you all. So Make the Road New Jersey is a member-led organization. We are 6,500 members strong. We have offices in Elizabeth, Perth Amboy, and Passaic. We run comités across the 3 cities. Our comités average between 30 to 80 people a week, and those committees have ballooned since the inauguration, right? This narrative that folks are hiding, some of it is warranted, and some of it is people are actually very desperate for information. They still have to go to work, they still have to take their children to school, and they are eager to know what they can do to keep their family safe, to keep their neighbors safe. And so that work continues to happen. We have a member who is 19 years old. He has significant brain damage and is, because of the abuse and negligence he experienced as a child, is able to and eligible to apply for a special protection called Special Immigrant Juvenile Status. Has been a member of the organization since he was since 2019 and is 19 today. And 3 weeks ago, was his hearing, his final hearing, and we went to the Newark courthouse just a couple of blocks away, and as we took the elevator up, immigration entered the elevator and took him, and we have not been able to locate him. We know that he was in Elizabeth and then was transported to Louisiana, and we have not been able to locate him since. But to the point about, there is no due process, we're sort of cutting in the middle. The fascism isn't far away. It's not in the abstract. It is here. It is in our backyard. And there are efforts to ramp up those things, right? We have, like you heard before, there is an effort to reopen Delaney Hall as a detention center. There is currently an effort to reopen the Union County Jail as an immigration detention center, which happens to be right behind our headquarters, literally right behind our headquarters. It's our office, and then there's a cemetery, and then there's a jail. To give you some context, Elizabeth is the 5th largest city in the state. We have the 2nd largest school district in the state. Our school district is split into 8 houses, and the jail is right in downtown. This obviously causes a huge concern, right? Increased ICE presence means increased racial profiling that comes and attacks Black, Brown, and AAPI communities specifically. And so I think the moment makes me think about what is the collective resistance that we are building? How are we building a sustained movement? That is the work that we have been doing since the first Trump administration. And so I think when you see these large protests and you see all of that stuff, oftentimes we say it's organic. It's not, right? There are people who are working every day going out and canvassing on the corner and maybe getting to talk to 20 people, and they go back to the office, and as a good organizer, they call them, they say, hey, you want to come to a meeting this week? We're going to talk about what our rights are. And they do that every single day, and they do that for years, so that when the moment comes that the ultra-right comes and takes office and you call the phone, they have 6 people to call to 6 people to call, and that's how you see Newark Airport get full at the Muslim ban.
It's really hard, I think, to identify like what is top of mind for me when it comes to immigration and, you know, some of the attacks that we've been facing. Certainly detention, lack of due process, and then, you know, this larger issue of like criminalizing communities of color. And, you know, there's a very direct parallel there to calling certain communities terrorist, and then that slippery line between the two that allows this government to rob us of our due process, send us to a foreign country, and then have no recourse for getting people back. So it shifts for me every day what's like my top concern. But I think the most recurring concern for me is that we're in this environment where the administration is more powerful and more vengeful than ever before. We've seen it already, right? We saw them go after students. We saw them go after law firms. We saw them go after funding. They went after college campuses. And, you know, just last week, the US Attorney General went after our own New Jersey governor and our own New Jersey Attorney General. And she did that not by serving paperwork or having any sort of mailed correspondence. She did it while commenting on a Breitbart article that was being covered by Fox News at 10 p.m. on a Thursday. And that's what we're up against, is this machine that masquerades the authority, masquerades the process, you know, all of the things that they do to convince their supporters that they're doing the right things, and yet their allegiance is not to the Constitution, it's to ratings and clickbait online. So when I think about what my most recurring concern is understanding that this targeting is going after individuals and institutions, and yet this moment in the opposition looks so different from 2017. 2017, who were the major leaders? Which were the states leading the resistance? It was long ago, but it wasn't that long ago. But, I mean, let's take a look at New York City. We had a mayor who launched one of the most ambitious municipal ID programs in the nation's history, and council members who started floating an idea about non-citizen municipal voting. In California, we saw sanctuary law after sanctuary law after sanctuary law get passed. This is 2017, like Nedia said, throngs of people showing up at the airport. 2024, 2025, the mayor of New York City is ridden by scandal, is getting a lot of his charges thrown out because of some secret dealing that he made with the administration. We have the governor of California inviting Steve Bannon on his new podcast. We have all of these threats that are coming down and no one who's willing to throw a punch. And that worries me far more than what executive order is coming next, what Congress is going to do next. There's such a vacuum of leadership and such an unwillingness to stand up and fight that is going to ruin us in this moment and every other fight we get into going forward.
Thanks, everyone. And, you know, I think to all of your point, we have to stand up in this moment, right? If we don't stand up, it is a slippery slope to what comes next. And all of us know what that might look like. I think we think a lot, for example, about the fact that dissent is being criminalized in this country, right? Mahmoud Khalil, for example, some of my colleagues are part of that legal team. And it is a horrifying thing to see the ways in which protected First Amendment speech, the core of our Constitution, right, is being gone after. And so if we don't have leaders who are willing to push back now, in addition to all of us in this room who are willing to push back now, we're missing a beat. Amy touched on this a little bit already, but we are seeing some differences in what the response looks like, right? So New Jersey is no stranger to responding to difficult moments. And back in 2017, not only in places like New York, but also in New Jersey, we saw people pushing for things like municipal IDs. In 2019, we had a landmark driver's licenses law that was passed that was aimed at protecting people. And so there are moments in which we have responded with strong pro-democracy messages and passed vital legislation and policies to protect immigrant communities. What differences are you seeing between how our legislature and our governor in New Jersey responded back in 2017 and how they're responding right now?
Well, first let me say there are some folks responding now, right? NJPAC, the Institute, Fund for New Jersey, everyone that's in this room, like there's very few people in this room that I'm seeing for the first time. A lot of us have been engaged in the right conversations more than just one time. So I'm just saying that because everything else that I'm gonna say is not so nice, but it doesn't apply to us, okay. So, I mean, it's true, like the fear that folks are feeling is very real and it's very valid and it's grounded in something that is happening to people right now. And yet we're not seeing any courage and leadership to let folks know that there's someone who has their back. Even if the federal government is against you, not all government is against you. But I don't think we're hearing that message coming out of Trenton. I don't think we hear it coming out of every city in New Jersey. And I think that that leads us into this moment of complying in advance, or for folks that are not as politically active or who do not hold the same analysis as those of us in this room, that compliance in advance is so important because then DEI does become a scary word, right? Saying Black Lives Matter instead of all lives matter does become scary and risky. But I think for us, in terms of meeting the moment, you know, in the advocacy space and in the activist space, language really matters, right? We have to use language that names the problem. We have to say Black Lives Matter because the problem is that we're undervaluing Black lives. We have to say not just anti-DEI, we have to call it what it is. It's pro-segregation. That's what they're trying to do. If you're scared of saying DEI, well, I'm sure you're pretty scared of saying you support segregation, right? But call it what it is, right? And I think even, you know, we all collectively use this like large blanket of democracy to talk about the world that we want to be in, but let's name the problem. We're not just pro-democracy in this room, we're anti-authoritarian. We're anti-fascist, another word that has been like blown completely out of context, right? But words really matter, and I think we need to get our lawmakers and our decision makers to be accountable to it because we see it all the time. They co-opt that language, and they want to come campaign in front of our bodegas and in front of our farmers markets and talk to our workers, and then they get into office and they pass nothing that we want them to pass and everything that we don't want them to.
Yeah, and I think it's all the more disappointing.
Y'all are so
Please
nice.
clap.
Why don't clap every time? We're over.
You don't have to clap for me though. Yeah, I was just gonna say, I think it's all the more disappointing because New Jersey is one of the most diverse, if not the most diverse state in the nation. It has people who claim to be progressive and committed to democratic values. This state is what other states are gonna look like some years hence. This has to be the place where we're figuring it out, and where we're not only defending against harmful actions, but really advancing our own affirmative vision of what we want this country to be. And I think I've said before, like the right is very good at multi-level organizing. When they were stymied on the federal level, they were moving very aggressively in states and cities. And if we're not doing the same now, then we are actually falling behind. I think we all know that authoritarianism really relies on anticipatory compliance, right? And you get into a cab now in Newark, and Kristi Noem's voice comes on to tell you to get out because she doesn't want aliens here, right? Like, where's the counter messaging? I think we just are really hungry for some more visionary leadership that, you know, speaks to what New Jersey can be in this moment. And I don't really understand the notion that sort of being silent or flying under the, trying to be nice about things and like inviting Trump to lunch and stuff is gonna like somehow keep us under the radar. Like, look all around you. What more could happen that isn't already happening?
Yes, so I'm honestly going to echo a lot of what Amy and Amber said, but I think to the point of, there is legislation that we are attempting to move currently, right? A heat standard to make sure that workers who are working in extreme heat have protections, right? The OSHA doesn't exist anymore, right? So we as a state have a responsibility to protect our workers, right? We're trying to make sure that the Immigrant Trust Directive is codified so that ICE can't enter the courthouses, just like I mentioned in the story before. We're trying to make sure that there is more deportation defense money because the processing time used to be much longer. Now it's 3 to 5 days, and we just have one immigration detention center until they set up 2 more, and so they're moving folks quickly, and so we need to be able to respond to the moment. But the refrain that you often get is, better to stay under the radar, right? If we do these pro-immigrant things, we bring attention to ourselves. But actually, when you stay quiet, you allow the fascism to fester, right? And you can have a soft front, but you can't have a soft back too. What are the red lines that the state has? And I think the other responsibility that we have is a collective responsibility. I think folks often forget that New Jersey can serve as the bellwether, as the referendum for what happens at the national level. We are one of only 2 states in the entire country that has a gubernatorial race. And I think folks often forget that it was New Jersey that was the first on the East Coast to pass things that were pro-worker and pro-immigrant. Driver's licenses for all, financial aid for undocumented people, a guaranteed severance, wage theft protections, paid sick, a $15 minimum wage that included teen workers, occupational licenses for undocumented people. All of that happened in this state before it happened anywhere else on this coast. And we have a responsibility as voters to make sure that we are putting forth a candidate and we're making sure that we're turning folks out, because the story of what is possible 300 days after the ultra-right takes power starts here. And it allows other candidates, it allows other people, local offices all across the country to have the courage to say, if it could have happened just less than a year after he took office, then it's possible here in Arizona and in Georgia and Nevada. And we have that responsibility as voters to make sure that other people have the ability to say, I will try to in my state.
And so I think it's clear that from everything people are saying here, from everyone in the room, that this moment demands action. And I know Nedia has touched on this a little bit already, but oftentimes when we talk to people in positions of power about the importance of passing pro-immigrant bills, about the importance of passing pro-democracy bills, there is sometimes a hesitance to do so. And despite that, we know that the state has both the authority and the moral responsibility to act. So right now in this moment, what are your members prioritizing? What are you prioritizing at the state and at the local level in order to best support immigrant communities and, importantly, to build the version of the world that we want to live in?
I'm happy to start. So I think I feel like every time we come, like we do talks like this, I always share this, but if one of the things that the ultra-right has done very successfully is infrastructure. Their structure is top notch. And one of the things that is like, a great read is the 1970 Powell memo by Lewis Powell. And in it, Lewis Powell, who would then go on to become a Supreme Court justice, talks about how he believes so deeply that conservative views have not gotten their day in the sun. And he makes this plea to the ultra-right to, like, at the time, this is like the Vietnam War, and that liberal views have infested our universities. We see it in our courts. It is in the mainstream. It's in our culture. And he says we need to come together and we need to make sure that our ideas, we need to set up think tanks. He says this. We need to set up think tanks. We need to make sure our judges are put up in courts. We need to get professors into universities. We need to. He also says, right, that businesses, it's the very beginnings of when businesses become lobbyists, right, and corporations become people. And this idea really starts in the 1970s. And you see, right, he's almost like Nostradamus. Nostradamus, all that stuff comes to light, right? It was taken over the courts. You see, I remember I went to, I took a class with Professor Arkey's, one of the architects of DOMA, and I remember sitting in the classroom where he talked about how DOMA was going to protect this country from bestiality. And this man was teaching the future minds of tomorrow. But like, all this to say is that their infrastructure was successful. And you see that even now, right? You have, in Passaic County, right? So New Jersey, very often considered a blue wall state. And in 2024, we had lower voter turnout than in 2019, or than in 2016 and in 2020, even more egregious in communities of color. Largely, yes, partly because of the line, partly because this idea of saved democracy does not resonate with Black, Brown, and API voters. But you saw in this, sort of sea of blue, Passaic County was just a beet red. Passaic County is one of the largest populations of Pueblo Mexicans outside of the state of Puebla. Has one of the largest Muslim populations in the entire country. And it flipped red. And you see Scott Presler, who was a very famous political operative and who, folks say that he was the one who delivered Pennsylvania for the Trump administration. He's in Passaic County. When I canvass, I see him, right? So where there is voter registration gaps, the ultra-right has come in to fulfill it. And they can do that because they have the infrastructure to do so, right? They have community groups, right? They have Knights of Columbus, and they have veterans clubs, and they have spaces, and all of that stuff, right? When people feel like they are in community, that is how you build trust, and that is how you grow. And that is the same thing that we need to do in the state.
I think, there are a lot of priorities that, our organizations work across together. And, if you are coming to tonight's event, I definitely would recommend, taking a look at some of the tabling and, ways to get involved in that. But I think this, analogy that Sherrilyn shared earlier about, the harvest and the planting is something that, all of our organizations have been thinking about for a long time. When I came to the Alliance in 2021, we launched a brand new arm of the coalition. Classically, the Alliance had been an advocacy coalition. We brought together organizations so that we could push for really big policies together. But after 2020, we realized that we're only pushing so far unless we build the movement. And it was in 2021 that we launched the movement building team, and we engaged in we say it's 1 year, it really almost lasted 2 years, but we went on this listening tour across our membership. The Alliance is the state's largest immigration coalition. Now we bring together 60 organizations from across the state. But we made it a point in that early spring of 2021, before even, the full vaccine implementation hadn't rolled out, if you remember what that spring and summer was like. But we made a point of sitting down with as many organizations as we could and asking them about persistent needs and emerging trends. And time again, we had folks tell us, every organizer we just hired burnt out. Long-term leaders who've been with me through thick and thin, they've burnt out, or they've left for the private sector because a loved one lost their job, lost their house, did this, did that. They're not in this sector anymore. And now I have a bunch of new young folks, or folks that are new to this work, and I have no one to train them up, right? I have nowhere for them to cut their teeth. And it was out of that listening tour that we started the Alliance's Advocacy Academy. And I know there's some Advocacy Academy graduates in the room and also some folks who taught at Advocacy Academy. So I want to give a huge shout out to those folks. But out of Advocacy Academy, we've really talked about how do we dismantle some of these things while also building the new things? And when we build those new things, how do we make sure that they don't replicate the thing that we just tried to destroy? And there's no easy answer to that, but we really need this analysis within our movement because, as Sherrilyn said, Trump, for whatever you want to say about him, is an extremely effective communicator. He may not be a policy genius, but he's really, really effective at identifying weaknesses, making people afraid of those weaknesses so that they identify with something else. And we saw that in New Jersey, right? We saw that with Latino communities. We saw that with Asian American and Pacific Islander communities. But it wasn't unique to this election. That is a trend that has been happening for a long time, where campaigns do not tailor their messaging. They do not think about the impact of how certain words land with certain audiences. And as a result, they rely on the high propensity voters, which in a state like New Jersey that has its state elections on odd years, guess who those high propensity voters are? Not our folks, because no one's reaching out to them to remind them about deadlines or about this important school board election that just happened on Tuesday, right? No one's going and flyering in our neighborhoods. They're not at our bus stops talking to folks. And so we don't turn out in those critical years, and then we're marked lower, which means when it comes to spending those campaign dollars, we're at the very bottom before they decide to reach out to us. And even then, they're just running a flyer through Google Translate.
Just to take us back to state policy for one, no, yes to all of that. Look, I have Asian American organizer allies in Missouri. They just had to beat back an immigrant bounty hunter bill that came through their state legislature that would have paid, citizens like us $1,000 for helping to turn in, an illegal, an alien. We're not having to do that in New Jersey, but still, I expect there to be a sharp, sharp difference between how our state goes through this and how a state like Missouri goes through this. I expect it to be night and day. And that's why we have been in coalition pushing for our state legislature to pass the Immigrant Trust Act, which would thank you, which would codify once and for all that our state law enforcement resources are just not going to be used in the service of federal immigration enforcement. They have their own people for that. They have billions and billions and are about to get more. We need to focus on enforcing our own criminal code. Those resources need to be used not for that, basically. And that can't be something that's dependent on who we elect next as governor, right? We need to make sure that is enshrined. We need to make sure it's clean. It's not in some cases we would, but let's just draw a line and say we're not going to be using our local police for that. We're not going to be having our sheriffs, pull people over for a traffic stop and then ask them if they have their new alien registry papers on them. This is New Jersey. We're just not going to have that. And likewise, thank you. We can also do basic things like increase funding for legal representation for New Jersey's deportation detainment defense initiative. This is very expensive work to do. One lawyer might be able to handle 20 cases because these cases, each one is a pretty heavy load, but we have the largest undocumented population in the world or one of the largest for a reason. It's because our country has benefited from that, so we have a responsibility to our immigrant populations.
Thank you, everyone. We are at time, and I know there's index cards on all of your tables, so if you have questions, there's going to be ushers going around the room and collecting them. While we're doing that, can I just ask everyone, you all have a minute. What is your call to action to everyone in this room to build power together?
I can start. So it's mid, almost late April, which means May is coming up, which is Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. May 1st, of course, is also International Workers' Day. This work and this existence is very tiring. We all recognize that. And yet we're continuing to show up. And I try and internalize with myself what it is that makes me show up. And there's two quotes that I'd like to share. One is from Philip Vera Cruz. He was a Filipino farm worker in California, mobilizing for farm worker and immigrants' rights because exactly right. The reason that our working standards are so poor is that they want to set the floor so high, set the floor so low, that becomes the ceiling for the undocumented workforce, right? And so, labor and immigrant justice are so closely intertwined. But Philip Vera Cruz says, a movement has to go beyond its leaders. And when we think about movement building, that's exactly what we are trying to think of too. Again, this harvesting versus planting analogy is that it can be really easy for lawmakers, for donors, for funders to chase the flavor of the month. But we need to be identifying the problem that produces all of those flavors, and we need to invest our people and our resources in that. We have to move beyond, as Ryan and Sherrilyn were saying, we have to move beyond the figureheads, and that's when you really know it's a movement. When you don't know who's responsible, when you don't know who put in the long work or the long hours, that is when it's truly a movement. And so, I think about that Veracruz quote often. The second one that I think about is from Filipino writer Jose Rizal. Jose Rizal is a national figure in the Philippines. He was executed by the Spanish colonial government for his revolutionary writings. And he has this slogan that comes up a lot in his work, no history, no self, which means you exist, your identity is a result of the context that you were born in, that an ancestor gave to you, right? And your opposition in the world that you live in is something that was handed down to that person too. So if you want to know yourself and know what you should do, you have to know your history. And I think folks hear me say this a lot, but I really believe that struggle and resistance is a family heirloom that I have to carry. For each of us in this room, that rage, that anger, that struggle, that discipline, it's because one person a long time ago survived and passed that on to you. And we have a duty not just to the future generations, we have a duty to our ancestors to live that righteous insubordination in everything that we're doing, because that moment existed for them, it's existing for us now, and we need to fulfill that legacy.
Save time. Ami, you want us to go to your questions, or you want us to? Okay.
Do you want to be really one?
I want to be good about your time.
Okay. So let's start with the questions because we have quite a few from the audience. Thank you, everyone. So I think this one builds actually on a lot of what you've all raised here towards the end, which is to build a stronger infrastructure in terms of creating a more cohesive community. How can organizations come together instead of working in separate or competitive ways?
I have the answer. So after the elections, we had this same question. Us, working families, AAPI, the Alliance, what are we going to do? The tides have turned. And a few weeks after the election, we launched what we call the Million Voter Project. Million Voter Project is an effort to reach 1 million New Jersey voters, and we're talking about the folks, high opportunity, Black, brown, AAPI voters throughout the state, right? There is a narrative that we had ceded the election to Trump. And that is not true. The true story is that people stayed home. And why did they stay home, right? We should not allow people to create a narrative about somehow Black and brown people have gone for Trump. That's not true. They made a decision and they used their vote as their power and they stayed in. And we need to go to people and ask, what happened? What are the bread and butter issues that keep you would have allowed you to participate? There is no line in this state anymore, right? We have abolished the county line. So now there is a responsibility that candidates have to listen to voters. It's no longer anymore about we only go to high propensity voters. Now you got to talk to everybody because everybody can decide whether you're in or you're out. Million Voter Project is a nonpartisan effort because we just want to know what happened, and that data will serve as a resource for everyone. Million Voter Project has also now extended to both New York and Virginia because they also have consequential elections, and the work that we do in our 3 states will be the message testing that the country can use. So you can invest in MVP.
So our next question is, what is the best way to protect immigrants? If it is the Immigrant Trust Act, what is the pressure point we all can push to get this passed?
I don't want to say too much.
So why isn't immigration, humane, decent immigration policy as much of an issue as any kitchen table issue for electeds? Why do they all see it as just a sort of losing issue that they're not going to win in, or they're bad people who are winning in a terrible way, right? It's because they need to hear more from, our politicians need to hear more from us, that this matters to us, that we are part of this sort of silent, decent majority that supports common sense immigration reforms and, humane treatment of all of our communities. Look, the Alien Enemies Act that I talked about earlier was last used in World War II to incarcerate 120,000 Japanese Americans, 2/3 of whom were citizens. And that started, by the way, with the government rounding up community leaders, right? Temple priests, people in language schools, and sort of seeing what the reaction was. And there, and municipalities and states, local jurisdictions, they just went along with it. And I think we're in a very similarly scary place now where we see students, being detained after exercising their rights to free speech. I think just our electeds just need to hear, not from me and Amy and Nedia again and again and again, although we'll keep trying, but they need to hear from all of you, right? You need to call your state electeds, and please do ask them to pass the Immigrant Justice Act. But you also need to call your federal electeds. Just like put it on your calendar, do it once a week or something, and let them know that you don't support the Trump deportation agenda. You want to see our Congress standing up for that, for us. Thank you.
Ami, if I could, I think, I just want to lean into this framing of the question, why is it that immigrants need so much protection? We're not frail or breakable. If anything, immigrant communities are some of the most resilient that you can find. But I think we need to name the problem. We need protections because our existing leaders are apathetic. The leaders above them are maniacs. We need to go after them. And it's not about what piece of legislation will shield, it's why do we need shields in the first place? When we talk about taxing corporations, sure, people talk about Amazon, they talk about Walmart, they talk about Tesla. Why aren't they talking about Geo Group, the private prison corporation that was the first to max out campaign contributions to Donald Trump? They're the billionaire class too.
Thank you. So I think a lot of what I'm hearing too, though, is that in addition to making sure that everyone in this room makes their voice heard, it's important for our leaders to display courage. And so how do we make sure in this moment that our elected officials and other people in positions of power are standing up for what's right? What's the step beyond making the call to them? How do you get them to the right place? How do you get them to vote? And not just vote, how do you get them to lead?
The entire assembly, the New Jersey Assembly, is up this year. So that's one way you get them to lead. You call your assembly person and be like, this is a big issue for me, and I'm a voter. And you don't have the county line anymore. I think, I cannot underline enough, in the state of New Jersey, right, for being a blue wall state, for the first time in almost 100 years, we are about to enter a real democratic election. The entire assembly is up for re-election. They can't hide underneath a particular candidate. None of the gubernatorial candidates can't win county conventions and then win this election. And that is our power, right? Asking the gubernatorial candidates when they come up tonight, what will you do to make sure that when you get into office, Immigrant Justice Act is nothing? What are you going to, well, I can't deliver because the Senate and the Assembly. I don't care. What are you going to do to whip it up? Right? It is each of our responsibility to put pressure because now we have this new power in us, right? And I think, the investment is so important, right? That we are investing in our communities to teach them about civic education, right? What Asada and Mikauri were able to do is powerful. It doesn't matter that only 3% of people turned out. It's because it's an investment that will take time, that we want to see returns on, but we need to continue to invest in canvassing and in community education and action. And we can't just throw money during election time. We need to make sure that we're doing year-round investment.
I think that year-round investment also looks like movement building. When we had the question about 2017 versus now, the laws that Nedia named, tuition, driver's licenses, these are things that are fought by and won for undocumented communities, non-citizen communities. And every day outside of Election Day is that day to pressure our lawmakers. It was in spring of 2021 that Greg Abbott launched Operation Lone Star. And then they used that to bus folks to our states as a field test to see whether we would actually stand up or not. And we didn't. And they won on messaging, they won on policy, and look where we are now. We can do that in New Jersey. We can be smarter than Greg Abbott. I believe it. But we need investments for election day so that we can topple things like the line and empower people to turn out. And then when those lawmakers get home after election night and they're breathing easy, they need to be afraid when they go to work the next day that someone's going to be harassing them about what to do next.
Great. And to that point, what can we do in this moment to strengthen the grassroots opposition movement? What are the sorts of investments that are needed to build the infrastructure that Nedia talked about?
I do think that we've lost ground in policy and politics because of our failure to invest in culture, community, relational organizing. You cannot just show up on someone's doorstep twice a year to ask them for their vote, with your progressive talking points and your Canva graphic or whatever you have with you, right? You have to be a presence in people's lives. So I think, you both talked about it already, but we do really need to build out all of the grassroots organizing in this state. And it doesn't always look, political, right? Sometimes it might look like helping people with their cultural celebration or getting someone connected to services that they need. I think the right is very good at just doing their food distributions and having a place where you can go at church where you can feel like community. We need to build out that same level of infrastructure for our communities.
So we have a question here, more aimed at what's going on and what people are seeing in the news. So HUD and Homeland Security have signed an MOU granting access to personal data through HUD, through IRS, and others, and have announced an intention to revoke housing assistance from mixed status families. What do you think could protect immigrant families from becoming unhoused? It's a very big question, I just want to say to whoever asked.
If New Jersey taxes the rich, we have more state levy dollars to provide state housing.
And I think, in New Jersey, I think when we're talking about specifically about housing, two things. The first is I think often we forget that, to Amber's point in the beginning, immigrants are complex people. We are renters, we are workers, we are patients, we are all these things. And many folks, during the pandemic, I mentioned at the top that we are a member-led organization, and one of the things that kept coming up during the pandemic was that housing was such a critical issue for our members. Largely because during the rent freeze in Jersey, lots of our members live in informal housing. And so they rent out a room in a basement. And so their landlord was like, well, I'll just call immigration because this isn't a real apartment anyway, so you're going to pay me. So they didn't get to experience a rent freeze where they were able to, keep their dollars while they were trying to find new work. And we have focused largely on doing housing work. And so we were able to pass two of the strongest rent control bills in Elizabeth and in Perth Amboy, where two of our centers are located. And we intend to put, housing on the ballot this year. I think, in thinking about our housing identity in the future, right, really investing in tenant unions. That is not an infrastructure that we have at scale in this state, but you have seen some states do this in very experimental ways, right? The Connecticut Tenants Union, the Kansas City Tenants Union, right? Where they are bringing together tenants for an entire city, and they're able to protect each other. I remember during the first Trump administration, many members did not feel safe coming to our community spaces. And so what we did is we would have a member from each ward come to the office, and we would train them on what the KYR or the Know Your Rights thing would be for that week. And then each of them would go back to their ward, and amongst the members, they would decide which apartment building in that ward they would meet in, and they would all go to that building. And that was the way that we were able to communicate our message in the first Trump administration. And we were able to grow by the thousands because you had whole apartment buildings coming. And so I think, it's not a silly response to say everything is organizing, but the responsibility that we have is not only set up cities as fortresses, but our schools as fortresses and our buildings as fortresses. And so that's why, you don't just send an undocumented person to a Know Your Rights presentation. You all go, right? When any one of us is unsafe, we are all unsafe.
Thank you, that was brilliant. And I think related to that, someone has asked, how are your respective organizations protecting your workers and your board members? And to this I would add your members, who may have consequences as a form of retaliation for speaking out.
I mean, without going too far into the nonprofit weeds, I mean, we've eaten a lot of like unforeseen cost. You know, new equipment for staff, VPNs, an IT consultant, you know, switching email servers, doing all these things on top of responding to the fires that are happening. And it's a very real risk. You know, Sherrilyn talked about like getting targeted, getting doxxed, and that does happen. It's happened to like multiple of us here. It's happened to many direct service providers who are just doing like warm senior meals for seniors that also happen to be immigrants. And so I think, you know, for folks that are turning out to marches or rallies, the question is not when is the next march, it was what supplies did you need to pull this off and how can I help you get that? The question for organizations is not how do I get involved, but like where are you stretched thin and where can I build there? Even if you're not from the community, you can still be part of the work. But there are a lot of, you know, it's not a nonprofit panel, but there's a lot of things that are just, you know, on top of trying to retain talent and develop strong leaders, we're also in this position where, crap, what if we do get an IRS audit? Or what if some crazy actor wants to hijack someone's phone or show up at the office and do whatever else?
Did any of you want to add? Thank you, Amy. Yeah, and I know there's a lot of conversations happening in our relative spaces too, just about like things like digital surveillance and security. And so know that there are ongoing conversations that many of us are involved in as we're thinking through what it means to best protect people that we work with too, right? The responsibility we have not only to our communities, but also to the folks that we work with. Our final question is, proposed incarceration facilities require approval from county governments in New Jersey. And so how are Essex and how are other counties, perhaps like Union, responding and reacting in this moment?
Yeah, so in 2021, we were able to win and pass a law that banned that banned immigration detention. And very quickly after, you saw in Essex County and in Hudson County, they were no longer detaining immigrants. The only detention center that we currently have in our state is the Elizabeth Detention Center. It has about 300 beds, but you'll have reports of folks, you know, saying that there's standing room only, and so they sleep standing up because there's not enough space. And the conditions are horrific. That detention center is owned by the private prison industry, CoreCivic. And after we were able to win this ban, CoreCivic filed a suit against the state on discrimination. And like while they figured it out, the detention center has been able to remain open. Geo Group has joined that lawsuit, and it is on these grounds that they say that they can reopen Delaney Hall in Newark. So too does Union County say that they can consider these negotiations because of the lawsuit. Now, we don't need immigration detention, and if Delaney Hall and Union County Jail were to open as private prisons, then New Jersey would have the most ICE detention beds on the entire East Coast, and we would become the ICE capital. And that is not who we are. That is not our identity as New Jersey. But it does feel like time and time again, we say that we stand for these values, but where is the action? We are a pioneer state. Where is our pioneer action? And so the work that we have and the charge for you all, right, is call the Union County Commissioners. Tell them you don't want a jail, right? The county's position is that they have a fiduciary responsibility to explore bids in order to bring revenue into the county. And our position is, it is so important to set red lines now about what you will and what you won't accept, because when you have $160 million offered to you on the table, it is much easier to say, well, we have to think about the taxpayer. But the taxpayer are immigrants, are black and brown and AAPI folks that you are going to imprison, and you are going to use their money to imprison them.
And it bears repeating that the actors in this space are like multi-million-dollar companies. They do have to go through the city for permitting. they have to renew their fire inspection, they have to get their certificate of occupancy, and they didn't, which is why the city of Newark filed a lawsuit against them and issued a stop work order. But we're talking about the city of Newark. We've got a lot of needs here in Newark, and we've got a lot of expensive things that need to be addressed. Core Civic is not just the largest private prison corporation in America, they're the largest in the world. They have endless resources to litigate this, to litigate our ban to death, as does Geo Group. And we're seeing these mega corporations, just like we're seeing with Tesla and everything else, make a mockery of our democratic process because they can always afford that fine. They can always hire up another lawyer and appeal it and appeal it and appeal it till it gets to the Supreme Court where we know how that's going to end up, right? So, yes, the law exists, but the folks who fought for things like that ban are folks that have been erased by the law, who've been marginalized by the law, who've been pushed to the side and said, actually, laws don't work for you because of your immigration status, and yet we still fought big things and won. We fought against big companies like Amazon before, here in New Jersey, and we kicked them out. We have the power, but we need the resources and we need that collective action to be able to push it through.
And if you talk to immigrant advocates in, for example, the southwest border states, it's very scary there because things can happen so quickly, right? They pick you up, maybe you have a hearing, they put you on a bus for 3 hours and you're gone, right? And with the expansion of immigrant detention in New Jersey, my fear is we become a border state where it's so easy to just throw them in one of these beds, get them on that plane out of Newark, and we never see them again. And there will be more of these oopsies where they deport people who have no reason to be deported to, for example, El Salvador.
And that's such a good point too, right? Because we know when they build these sorts of facilities, they fill them. That's the principle behind it. And so it's so important for all of us to make sure we're not letting those sorts of facilities open up. And of course, to make sure people never get into those facilities in the first place, right? Which gets to Amber's point about the Immigrant Trust Act. So this is all the time we have for this panel today. I want to lift up one thing that Amy said to her at the end that I hope we can all take away, which is that we have fought for big things before and won. And so I hope that our call to action right now is that we can keep doing that together and that you're all inspired to, as others say, make that weekly call to your lawmaker and demand that they take action, that you hold them accountable after an election, and that we keep working together to make sure we're building the world that we want to live in. Thanks, everyone.